A paw scraped against frozen ground. Then a snarl low, broken, the kind that came from something half dead and still fighting. Snow fell into a shallow ditch, where four small shapes pressed against a larger body for warmth. The larger body was bleeding. A man crouched 10 feet away with his coat dusted in white. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched the gray fur rise and fall under the snow, slower with every breath. His rifle hung loose at his side. He lowered it. He took one slow step forward, then another. The snarl came again, weaker this time, almost a whisper. His name was Holly's Crane, and the men at the lumber mill said he hadn't smiled in 20 years. What he did in the next 5 minutes would change 4 lives that didn't even know they were being watched. Stay with me on this one. The town at the foot of that mountain had its own way of talking about him. Holly's Crane. People would say the name like it was already a memory. Old Holly's up there. Old Holly's with his bad knee and his empty cabin. They figured he'd come down off that mountain in a pine box one day, and that would be that. He was 73 years old. His wife had been gone 9 winters. He'd worked the lumber mill for 40 years before that, and when the mill shut down in the 80s, he packed up what he had and built a cabin 2 hours up a logging road. He'd lived there ever since. Most folks in town hadn't seen him in 5 years. Some hadn't seen him in 10. Now here's the thing. Holly's had 4 grown children, and every one of them lived less than a day's drive away. You'd think that would mean something. You'd think there'd be visits, phone calls, a Christmas card. There wasn't much of any of that. There hadn't been for a long time. Believe me when I tell you, Holly's knew exactly why. His eldest was Marlene, 51 years old, lived in a big house with a circular driveway, and married a man who sold commercial real estate. Marlene used to call her father once a month, back when she thought he might still have something. The calls stopped about 6 years ago, right around the time word got around town that Holly's had sold his last truck, that he was scraping by on Social Security, that he wore the same coat he'd worn in 1985. Then there was Dean, the lawyer. 48, divorced twice, lived in a condo with a view of nothing. Dean called whenever there was paperwork he wanted his father to sign. Said it was for tax purposes. Said it was so the kids didn't have to deal with a mess someday. Holly signed nothing. The third was Rita, 44. Married a dentist. Moved up to a country club neighborhood where the houses all had the same shape. Rita stopped by once a year, around her birthday. She'd bring a card she expected him to fill out with a check. He never did. She'd stay 40 minutes. She'd complain about the smell of the wood stove. Then she'd leave. And then there was Jesse. Jesse was 39. The youngest. The quiet one. He worked construction. He rented a small place on the edge of a different town 2 hours east. Jesse called his father every Sunday. Every Sunday for 9 years, ever since his mother had passed. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't expect anything. Half the time the calls were 5 minutes long, and they talked about the weather. But the calls came. And on holidays, Jesse showed up. Sometimes with a casserole. Sometimes just with himself. Now you might be thinking, that's a clean enough story. 1 good son, 3 selfish kids. End of it. It wasn't. Because what nobody in that family knew, what not even Jesse knew, was that Holly's Crane had not actually been broke for a single day in his life. Not one. Back in 1973, when the mill was still running, Holly's had bought up 62 acres of timber rights from a man who needed cash fast and didn't know what the land was sitting on. Holly sat on those rights for 20 years. In 1994, he sold them to a railroad company for an amount that would have made most men retire to Florida. He didn't. He put it in a trust. He let it grow. He never touched a dollar of it. He kept living in his cabin. He kept wearing his old coat. He kept his name off everything that anyone could look up. He'd done it on purpose. He'd done it the year after his wife died, when he stood at the funeral and watched three of his children whispering about the house and the truck and what was in his name. Jesse had stood by the casket the whole time. Hadn't said a word about anything but his mother. That was when Holly's decided. He was going to find out who his children really were. And the only way to find out who they were was to make sure they thought he had nothing left to give them. So that's the man we're talking about. Old Holly's Crane. Broke on paper. Quiet in his cabin. Watching. And then on a Tuesday morning in late January, in a snowstorm that had been building for 2 days, Holly's went out to check his woodpile, and he heard the snarl. He almost turned around. That was the truth of it. A snarl in the woods, 2 hours up a logging road, with a storm coming in. That's not something a man Holly's age walks toward. He was 73. His left knee was held together by a metal pin from a logging accident in 1981. He had a rifle in the cabin, sure, but the rifle wasn't going to help if a pack of wolves wanted him. He stood by the woodpile, listening. And the snarl came again. It was wrong. He could tell that right away. Wolves don't make that sound when they're hunting. Wolves don't even make that sound when they're warning you off. The sound he was hearing was the sound of something that was already done fighting and was just trying to scare death off for another 5 minutes. He went and got the rifle. Then he went into the woods. He followed the sound about a quarter mile down a slope he had no business walking down in fresh snow. His boots punched through to mid-shin. His knee screamed at him. He kept going. And he found her at the bottom of a wash, half buried in a snowdrift, her right rear leg pinned in the rusted jaws of a coyote trap that hadn't legally been used in that county for 30 years. She was a gray wolf. Maybe 90 pounds. Maybe less with what she'd lost. Her muzzle was crusted with blood from where she tried to chew her own leg off. And pressed up against her belly, half frozen, half asleep, were 4 pups. They couldn't have been more than 5 weeks old. Holly stood there a long time. He'd seen things die in the woods before. Plenty of things. He'd watched the natural order play out more times than he could count. And his first thought, the thought a younger man might have called sensible, was that this animal was finished. The leg was destroyed. The blood loss was already too much. Even if he got her free, she'd never run again. And 4 pups that small in this kind of cold, without a mother who could hunt, they were done too. He should have walked away. He set the rifle down in the snow. Now I want you to understand something. Holly's Crane had not put his hand on another living thing with kindness in 9 years. Not since the night his wife died holding his hand in a hospital bed. He hadn't hugged his children. Hadn't shaken a stranger's hand. Hadn't petted a dog. 9 years of his hands doing nothing but chopping wood and turning pages. He knelt down beside that wolf. She snapped at him. Of course she did. Her teeth caught the sleeve of his coat and tore the fabric clean down to the lining. He didn't pull back. He waited. He let her see his other hand was empty. Then, slow as a man diffusing something that might go off, he reached for the spring on the trap. It took him 20 minutes to get her loose. 20 minutes of her teeth being 3 inches from his face. 20 minutes of those pups whimpering in the snow. 20 minutes of his knee on fire, and his fingers going numb because he'd had to take his gloves off to work the spring. When the trap finally let go, she didn't move. She just looked at him. He took off his coat. That coat, that 1985 coat the town liked to talk about. He wrapped it around the 4 pups and gathered them up against his chest. Then he picked up the mother. 90 pounds of bleeding wolf. He carried her up that slope in the snow on a knee held together with a metal pin. I don't know how he did it. I don't think he knew either. He made it back to the cabin at dark. He laid the mother on the floor of his woodshed, which was attached to the cabin, and had a small stove he kept lit through the winter. He put the pups in a wooden crate lined with old blankets. Then he went into the cabin, got his first aid kit, and came back. He cleaned that leg the best he could. He stitched it with fishing line and a needle he'd sterilized over the stove. He poured iodine in the wound that made her howl loud enough to rattle the shed door. And then he sat down across from her in the dark, his back against the wall, and he watched her breathe. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't sleep the next night either. By the third night she ate. He'd boiled down a piece of venison he had in the freezer and brought it to her in a tin bowl. She watched him for a long time before she'd touch it. Then she ate everything. He brought her another bowl. She ate that too. The pups had been on goat's milk he'd driven down the mountain for, the only trip he'd made all week. A week passed. Then two. The leg was healing. Not perfectly. She'd walk with a limp the rest of her life. But she'd walk. He started calling her Greta. He didn't know why. The name just came out of his mouth one morning, and after that it was her name. The pups he didn't name. He figured they weren't his to name. A month went by. February turned to March. The wolves had run of the shed and the small fenced yard behind the cabin, which Holly's had patched up with chicken wire and an old gate. Greta watched him every time he came outside. The pups followed him like he was one of them. The smallest of them, a runt with one ear that wouldn't stand up, took to sleeping across his boot whenever he sat on the porch. And one afternoon in early March, the sun came out for the first time in weeks. The snow was still deep, but the worst of the cold had passed. Holly sat down on the porch step with a cup of coffee in his hand. Greta lay in a patch of sun a few feet away. The pups tumbled around in the snow. And Holly's crane, for the first time in 9 years, closed his eyes and felt something close to peace. He didn't hear the car coming up the road. The first thing he heard was the engine cutting off. Then a car door. Then heels on gravel. Then his daughter Marlene's voice, calling his name across the snow like she was annoyed at the cold for existing. Holly's didn't get up. He set the coffee down on the porch step. Greta had already lifted her head. The pups, who had been tumbling in the snow, froze. Marlene came around the corner of the cabin in a cream-colored coat that cost more than the cabin itself. She saw the wolves. She stopped walking. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Dad, what in God's name?" Holly's just looked at her. Are those wolves?" Dad, you have wolves in your yard." "I have a wolf and her pups in my yard." "That's correct." Marlene took 2 steps back. Greta watched her the whole time. The pups had drawn close to their mother and were standing very still. "You need to get rid of them. Today. I'm calling Fish and Wildlife." "I'm calling." "You're not calling anyone." There was a tone in his voice she hadn't heard in years. She blinked at it. Then she shook it off. "Dad, I drove 3 hours up here. I drove because Dean said you'd been to the doctor. I haven't been to a doctor in 2 years. Well, someone said something. And I came up here because I was worried, and I find you sitting on a porch with 4 wild animals like you've lost your—" She stopped. She caught herself. And here, friends, is where you saw who Marlene really was, because the second she stopped saying, "lost your mind," she started looking around at the cabin. Not at her father. At the cabin. At the woodshed. at the trees behind the cabin. She was taking inventory. "Dad, we need to talk about this place." "Do we? You can't be up here alone. You know that. Dean and I have been talking. Rita too. We think it's time to consolidate. Put the property in a family trust. We'll handle everything. You don't even need to think about it." Hollis picked up his coffee. He took a sip. It had gone cold. "You drove 3 hours to tell me that." "I drove 3 hours because I love you, Dad." He didn't answer. She left 40 minutes later. She didn't hug him goodbye. She tried once to step closer to the porch, but Greta stood up and showed her teeth, and Marlene retreated without looking back. She got in her car. She drove off. And as her car disappeared down the logging road, Holly sat back down on the porch step. The smallest pup, the runt with the bent ear, climbed up onto his boot and went back to sleep. Hollis exhaled. Believe me when I tell you, he wasn't surprised by any of it. He'd been expecting it. He'd been expecting it for 9 years. If you're still with me on this, hit that subscribe button. I tell stories like this one every week, quiet stories, the kind your grandfather might have told on a porch, the kind that don't get told much anymore. Stick around for what comes next, because Marlene was just the first. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was Dean. Dean opened with concern. He'd heard from Marlene. He was worried. He thought he should come up. Hollis told him he was fine. Dean pressed. Then 15 minutes into the call, Dean got to the actual reason he was calling. He had drafted some documents. Quitclaim deeds. Some power of attorney paperwork. Just, for safety. For the family. For if anything happened. Hollis listened the whole way through. Then he said, "Send it. I'll look at it." He hung up. He never opened the envelope when it came. 3 days after that, Rita drove up. Unannounced. She brought a pie that she said she'd made, but Hollis recognized the bakery sticker on the bottom of the tin. Rita sat at his kitchen table for an hour. She didn't go anywhere near the wolves. She didn't ask about them. She didn't ask about him. She asked about the deed to the cabin. She asked who his lawyer was. She asked if he had a will, and when he said yes, she asked who he'd named. He didn't answer that one. She left without finishing the pie. Now here's where it changes. Because 3 weeks went by after Rita's visit, and not one of those 3 children called again. Not Marlene. Not Dean. Not Rita. They had taken their measure of him. They had decided he was a tired old man living with wolves and refusing to sign their papers, and they had agreed among themselves to wait him out. Hollis knew this because Jesse told him. Jesse told him on a Sunday phone call in late March. Jesse said, "Dad, I just want you to know. They've been talking. Marlene's been calling everyone. They think you're not well. I told her she didn't know what she was talking about. I said I'd come up and see for myself. You don't have to do that, son. I know I don't. I want to. I haven't seen you since November. That's too long. You driving up this weekend if the roads hold." Hollis was quiet on the line for a moment. "Bring boots. There's still snow up here." "I always bring boots, Dad." He hung up the phone. He looked out the window. Greta was at the edge of the trees, watching the road. Something inside Holly's crane shifted that afternoon. Not relief. Not exactly. Something more like a decision, finally settling into place. Jesse's truck came up the road Saturday morning. It was an 04 Ford that Jesse had bought used in 2011 and had been keeping alive on his own labor ever since. The bed was loaded down. Hollis watched from the porch as his son climbed out and stretched. Jesse was tall, took after his mother in the face. He raised one hand in a wave and started unloading. He didn't unload his suitcase first. He didn't unload anything for himself first. The first thing he carried up was a 40-pound bag of dog food and a case of canned meat. The second thing was a hardware store bag with 2 big tubes of antibiotic ointment, a roll of gauze, and a box of latex gloves. The third thing was groceries for Hollies. Then finally, a duffel bag. Hollies watched him work. He didn't say a word until Jesse came up onto the porch. "You bring all that for me or for them?" Jesse glanced at the wolves. Greta was watching him from the open door of the woodshed. "Marlene called me Wednesday night. Said you had wild animals up here and you weren't taking care of yourself. I figured if she was that wrong about the second part, she might be wrong about the first part too. So I brought stuff just in case. She was wrong about all of it." "Figured." Jesse set the duffel down. He looked at Greta. Greta looked back. Then Jesse did something that Hollies remembered for the rest of his life. He didn't approach the wolf. He didn't make a fuss over her. He just walked past her like she lived there. Because she did. He went into the cabin to put the groceries away. Now here's the thing. Wolves know. They know in the first 10 seconds. Greta watched Jesse the whole time he was in that cabin. When he came back out, she was still watching. But her ears weren't pinned anymore. The pups, who had been hiding behind her, came out and sat down in a loose semicircle to look at this new tall thing. Jesse stayed 3 days. In those 3 days, he split a cord of wood that Hollies had been meaning to get to since November. He patched the roof of the woodshed where it had been leaking onto Greta's bedding. He drove down to the hardware store and brought back a real first aid kit, the kind veterinarians use, and he showed Hollies how to use the things in it. He didn't ask about the wolves except once to ask Greta's name, and when Hollies said it, Jesse just nodded and said, "Suits her." On the second night, a storm came in. Not as bad as the January storm, but bad enough. The power went out around 10. Hollies lit the oil lamps. Jesse fed the wood stove. They sat in the front room and didn't talk much, the way the two of them never did. Greta had come in from the shed because the wind was rattling the door, and she lay in front of the stove with the pups draped over her like blankets. Around midnight, Jesse said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why didn't you call me before about all this? About her, the trap, the leg. You did it all by yourself." Hollies looked at the fire for a long time. "I didn't want to bother you. You wouldn't have been bothering me. I know that." Now, Jesse didn't push. He just nodded. He put another log in the stove. A little later, he said, "Marlene's going to come back, you know. Probably with Dean. I know. They're going to push you on signing things. I know that too. What are you going to do?" Hollies was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that didn't make sense to Jesse right then, but would make sense later. He said, "Son, I've already done it." Jesse looked over. "Done what?" "Made up my mind. About all of it. About this whole family. About what I've got and what I'm doing with it. Dad, I'm not asking for any of that. I want you to know. I never have. I know that too. Believe me. That's how I know." Jesse left Sunday afternoon. He had to be back at work Monday morning. He hugged his father at the truck. It was a real hug, the kind that lasts a second longer than you expect. Then he climbed in and drove off down the logging road. Greta walked to the edge of the porch and watched the truck disappear. The runt with the bent ear sat on Hollies' boot. Hollies went inside. He went to the drawer under his kitchen sink. He pulled out the envelope from Dean. He opened it for the first time. He read the deeds. He read the power of attorney. He read every word. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and he wrote a letter. He wrote it in pen on lined paper, and he wrote it slowly, the way a man writes a letter when he knows it's going to be the last word on a subject. He wrote one letter. Then he wrote 3 more. 4 letters in total. He addressed them by hand. The next morning, he drove down the mountain, the first time he'd driven in 11 weeks. He went to a lawyer's office in town, an old friend who'd handled the trust back in 1994. He spent 2 hours in that office. When he came out, the trust had been rewritten. He drove home. He fed the wolves. He sat on the porch in the late sun. Spring was coming. He could feel it in the wood under him, in the smell of the air. Greta lay beside him, and her 4 pups, who weren't really pups anymore but young wolves, ran in a loose circle in the yard. The letters went in the mail the following Monday. Marlene got hers first. It arrived in a heavy envelope, addressed in her father's handwriting, with a lawyer's return address she didn't recognize. She opened it at her kitchen counter. She read the first line, then the second, then the third. She had to sit down. The letter said this. It said Holly's crane was alive, in good health, and writing to inform her that a trust he had established in 1994 had been finalized in its distributions as of the previous week. It said the trust contained a sum of money she would not have believed if he'd told her, plus the timber rights to 62 acres, plus shares in a railroad company that had been quietly compounding for 30 years. It said none of it was going to her. The letter explained why. It explained it gently. It explained it without anger. It said, "You were not unkind to me, Marlene. You were unkind to a man you believed had nothing left. I have watched you for 9 years, and what you have shown me is that your love is contingent on what I can give you. I cannot honor that with what I have built." There was one more line at the bottom. It said, "I forgive you, but I am not going to fund what I cannot respect." Dean got the same letter. So did Rita. Different names, same body, same last line. Dean called the lawyer the next morning. The lawyer said, "Your father is of sound mind. He has been planning this for nearly a decade. There is nothing to contest." Dean said he wanted to come up the mountain. The lawyer said, "He told me you would say that. He said to tell you he is not receiving visitors at this time." Rita didn't call anyone. Rita drove up the mountain that same afternoon. She got within a quarter-mile of the cabin. The road had been chained off. There was a hand-painted sign on the chain. It said, "Not today." She turned around. She drove home. She cried for the first half of the drive and was furious for the second half. By the time she got back to her dentist husband's big house, she had decided this was an injustice. But she never came back up the mountain again. Jesse's letter arrived last. He opened it on a Wednesday evening after work, sitting on the steps of his rented house. He read it 3 times. He set it down. He picked it back up. He read it again. He called his father. Holly's picked up on the second ring. "Dad. Son. What is this?" "It's what I told you I'd already done." Jesse was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't want it, Dad." "I know you don't. That's how I know you're the one who gets it." "It's too much." "It's not too much. It's exactly what's right." There was a long silence. "Dad, I need to come up there. I'd like that. This weekend. Bring boots. Mud season. I always bring boots, Dad." He hung up. Holly sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. Greta was curled by the wood stove. Spring had really come now. The snow was almost gone. Through the window he could see the 4 young wolves out in the yard, taller and leaner than they'd been in January, their winter coats already starting to shed in patches. He stood up. He went out onto the porch. The runt, and he still called him the runt even though he was no smaller than his siblings anymore, trotted over and pressed his head into Holly's hand. Holly scratched the bent ear. He looked out at the trees. In another month, Greta would be ready to leave. He knew that. The pups would go with her. They'd find a territory of their own. He'd known from the first day that this wasn't a forever thing. Wild animals don't owe you forever. They owe you nothing, in fact. Anything they give you free. But here was the thing about Greta. The thing that surprised him. She came back. Not that summer. That summer she left, the way he'd known she would, and he stood on the porch the morning she walked her pups into the trees and didn't try to stop her. She turned once and looked at him. Then she went. But the following winter, that next January, almost a year to the day from when he'd found her in the trap, he opened his cabin door one morning, and there was a gray shape sitting in the snow on his porch. Greta. Older. Thinner. Limping a little worse. But Greta. And behind her, where she could see them, 4 young adult wolves stayed back at the tree line, watching. She'd come back to say hello. Or maybe to say something else. Holly's didn't pretend to know what wolves think. But she sat there with him for an hour on his porch while he drank his coffee. Then she got up. She walked down the steps. She crossed the yard. And she disappeared into the trees with her grown children. She came back the next winter, too. And the one after. And every time she came, Jesse was the one who happened to be visiting that weekend, because Jesse had been coming up to the cabin twice a month for years by then. On Tuesdays, his father would call him just to talk about the weather. Holly's crane lived another 11 winters in that cabin. He died on a Sunday afternoon in March, with his son holding his hand. They buried him on the mountain. The trust had already been transferred. The land already belonged to Jesse. And the wolves, well, some folks in that valley still see them sometimes. A gray female with a limp. Or one with a bent ear. People who never knew Holly's don't think much of it. But the people who did, they know.